I still remember the morning when everything began to feel different. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy, uneasy, and full of unspoken words. For years, I had lived in this home with my son and his family. It wasn't just a house to me, it was the place where I raised him, watched him take his first steps, and taught him how to say his prayers. Every corner had a memory. Every wall still held laughter that once filled these rooms. But lately, things had changed. My daughter-in-law had become distant. She no longer asked me how I was feeling or whether I had eaten. The warmth in her voice had turned into polite silence. And my son, he had started coming home late, avoiding long conversations. I tried to convince myself that maybe they were just busy. People change with time, I told myself. Maybe I was overthinking. That morning, I woke up early, as always. The air was cool, and the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains. I went to the kitchen to make tea, just the way I had done for decades. But when I entered, I saw my daughter-in-law already there. She was standing by the stove, making breakfast for her husband and children, something she usually never let me do anymore. "Good morning," I said softly. She didn't look up. After a pause, she said, "Good morning," but her voice carried no warmth. I smiled anyway. "I can help if you like." "No, it's fine," she replied quickly. So, I sat down quietly at the table. The clock ticked, the kettle hissed, and the smell of toast filled the air. But no one spoke. My grandchildren came rushing in, their laughter echoing down the hallway. For a brief moment, my heart lifted. They ran to their mother, hugged her, and asked about their school day. They didn't notice me sitting there, and that's when it hit me how invisible I had become in my own home. I sipped my tea slowly, pretending everything was fine, but deep inside, something cracked. I wasn't angry, just hollow. When my son finally came down, he smiled faintly. "Morning, Ma," he said, then kissed his kids and left for work. That used to be my moment, when he'd sit with me for a few minutes, talk about his day, or ask for my prayers. Now, all of that had faded into routine, polite, distant, and cold. That evening, I sat by the window as the sky turned orange. The sound of laughter from the living room reached me, my family watching TV together. No one called me. No one asked me to join. So, I stayed in my chair, wrapped in my shawl, staring at the fading sun. For the first time, I felt like a guest in my own home. And somewhere deep in my heart, I knew something was changing. And it wasn't just the weather. Days passed, one after another, each one quieter than the last. The laughter in the house continued, children playing, television running, plates clinking during dinner. But my place in all of it seemed to shrink a little every day. I tried to help wherever I could. Folding laundry, setting the table, watering the plants. But each time, my daughter-in-law would say gently, "It's okay, Mom, you should rest." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried a finality, a message I was beginning to understand. Rest. That word used to sound comforting. Now it felt like a reminder that I wasn't needed anymore. One afternoon, I heard them talking in the living room. I didn't mean to listen, but their voices carried down the hallway. My son said, "Maybe Mom should visit Aunt Clara for a few weeks. The kids need their space too." There was a short silence. Then my daughter-in-law replied softly, "It might be good for her. She'll be happier there." Happier there. Those two words landed like stones in my heart. Was I really making them unhappy? Was my presence now a burden in the home I built? That evening, when we sat for dinner, I couldn't taste the food. They talked about work and school, but not once did anyone ask about my day. I smiled when they looked my way, pretending everything was fine. After everyone went upstairs, I sat alone in the dim light of the dining room. The clock ticked softly. The air smelled faintly of leftovers and detergent. I stared at the family photos on the wall, birthdays, holidays, smiling faces, all frozen in time, and I realized how far away those moments now felt. I whispered to myself, maybe they're right. Maybe I'd be happier somewhere else. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because happiness isn't about comfort or quiet. It's about belonging, and I no longer knew where I belonged. The next morning, my son left early again. My daughter-in-law passed by me in the hallway. She smiled, quick and polite, then went about her chores. Even the grandchildren had started spending more time upstairs with their screens and friends. So I began spending more hours in the garden. It was the only place where silence didn't hurt. The flowers didn't talk back, but they didn't ignore me either. I'd water them slowly, remembering how my husband used to laugh at me for talking to plants. Sometimes, when the wind blew softly, I could almost hear his voice again, gentle, teasing, full of love. And then I'd close my eyes and whisper, "I miss you." That day, as the sun set behind the trees, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe I couldn't change how they felt about me. Maybe the best thing I could do was learn to let go quietly, with the same grace I once taught my son to live with. But still, every night, when I lay down, a single thought echoed in my mind. How did love turn into silence? The days started to blend together. Morning light, coffee, a quiet breakfast at the far end of the table. No one was rude, yet no one really saw me either. I became part of the background, the sound of the kettle, the soft footsteps on the stairs, the faint smell of bread from the toaster. Everything moved on, and I stood still in the middle of it. Sometimes, I'd try to start a conversation. How was school today? I'd ask my granddaughter. She'd smile politely and say, "Good, Grandma," before putting her earphones back in. Her world was somewhere else now, on screens, in chats, in songs I didn't know. I couldn't blame her. She was young, living her own story. But a part of me wished she'd sit down beside me, just for a little while, and tell me about her day. One afternoon, I decided to bake cookies, the same recipe I used to make when my son was a boy. The smell filled the whole kitchen, warm and sweet. For a moment, it felt like old times again. I imagined him running in, smiling, stealing a cookie before dinner. But when he came home that evening, he didn't even notice. He walked past the kitchen, talking on the phone about work. The cookies stayed untouched on the counter until the next morning. I quietly wrapped them in a box and left them by the sink. No one asked who made them. That night, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. The neighborhood was calm. Somewhere, a dog barked. A car passed by. And I thought, this is how life fades away. Not with noise, but with silence. A few days later, my daughter-in-law approached me gently. She said, "Mom, you've been so quiet lately. Are you okay?" I smiled and replied, "I'm fine, dear. Just tired." But what I wanted to say was, I miss being part of this family. She nodded and went back to her chores. Her kindness was real, but distant. It felt like she was talking to a guest, not to someone who once held her son in her arms. That evening, I found an old box of photographs in my drawer. There were pictures from when my husband and I moved into this very house, young, hopeful, full of dreams. I touched his face in the photograph, tracing the faint smile that used to make me feel safe. "Do you see this, John?" I whispered. "Our home isn't the same anymore." A tear rolled down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away. Crying wouldn't change anything. Sometimes, love doesn't disappear suddenly, it just fades. Little by little, until you barely recognize it. Before going to bed, I stood by my son's door. I almost told him how I felt. But then I heard him laughing softly with his wife. And I didn't want to interrupt their peace. So, I turned away and walked back to my room quietly, like someone who no longer belonged. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized how heavy silence can be when it's filled with memories. That morning felt different. The air was still, heavy, almost waiting for something to happen. I woke up early, long before anyone else. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive. Like it knows a secret you don't. I made myself a cup of tea and sat near the window. The garden outside looked peaceful, bathed in pale sunlight. The flowers I'd planted months ago had grown tall, bending gently in the breeze. It made me smile for a moment, then the ache returned. The ache that never really left. As I sat there, I thought about all the years I had spent in this home. The laughter, the birthdays, the nights spent waiting for my son to come home safely. Everything had changed, yet I was still here, clinging to what used to be. When my son came downstairs, he looked surprised to see me awake so early. "Good morning, Mom," he said, distracted, scrolling through his phone. "Good morning, dear," I replied softly. I wanted to say more, to tell him I missed him, to ask if he still needed me, but the words stayed inside. A little later, my daughter-in-law joined us. She looked tired but polite, holding her coffee. After a few moments of small talk, she said gently, "Mom, Clara called yesterday. She said she'd love to have you visit for a while." I froze. So, they had already talked about it. I nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "That would be nice," I whispered. It's been a long time since I've seen her. But inside, I felt a quiet sting. The kind you feel when you realize a decision has been made for you. The rest of the day went by like any other. The children went to school. My son left for work. The house fell silent again. In that silence, I began to pack a small bag. Not because anyone told me to, but because I finally understood my time in this house had ended long before today. I folded my clothes neatly, one by one, stopping now and then to hold an old sweater or a photo frame. Each item had a memory attached to it. The sound of my husband's laughter, the smell of cinnamon on winter mornings, the feeling of little hands hugging me goodnight. When I reached the bottom of the drawer, I found an old letter. It was from my husband, written years ago when he was away for work. His words were simple but full of warmth. "No matter where life takes us, remember, home is wherever you are." I held that letter against my heart and whispered, maybe that's still true. By evening, I had finished packing. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the suitcase. It wasn't heavy, not like my heart. When my son returned home, I told him quietly, "I'll visit Clara for a few weeks. You don't have to worry." He looked relieved, almost grateful. "Of course, Mom," he said. "You'll like it there." He hugged me, quick, gentle, distant. The kind of hug that feels polite, not heartfelt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I looked around the room, tracing the shadows on the walls. Everything here had a story, every scratch, every mark, every frame. And soon, I'd be leaving it all behind. Before closing my eyes, I whispered to myself, maybe love means stepping away when your presence starts to feel like a burden. The morning I left, the sky was pale and quiet. A soft fog rested on the street, wrapping everything in stillness. I placed my small suitcase near the door and looked around the house one last time. The curtain swayed gently. The ticking clock echoed through the living room. Everything looked just as it always had, yet it all felt so distant now. My son helped me carry the bag outside. He didn't say much. Neither did I. Words felt useless now. They couldn't fix what silence had already broken. When the taxi pulled up, I turned once more toward the house. I wanted to memorize it, every brick, every window, every memory it held. This was the place where I had given everything I had, love, care, and years of my life. And now, it was time to walk away quietly. My daughter-in-law came to the door and said, "Take care, Mom. Call us when you reach." I smiled and nodded. "Of course, dear." But inside, I whispered, "Will you even notice when I don't call?" The driver loaded my bag and asked where I was headed. "To Willow Lane," I replied softly. "Near my sister Clara's house." He nodded and started the car. As we drove away, I looked through the window. The house grew smaller in the distance, like a chapter closing behind me. For the first few miles, I felt light, almost peaceful. Then, suddenly, a wave of emptiness washed over me. The kind of emptiness That comes when you realize you have nowhere you truly belong anymore. I tried to distract myself by watching the streets pass by, the children walking to school, the shopkeepers opening their stores, a young couple laughing on the sidewalk. Life was moving on, as it always does. Halfway through the journey, the taxi stopped at a red light. A little girl was selling flowers near the road. She looked around 7, her hair messy, her hands dusty, but her smile, it was pure. She walked up to my window and said, "Would you like some flowers, Grandma?" Something in her voice touched me deeply. I nodded and bought a small bunch of daisies. As she handed them to me, she whispered, "You look sad. But don't worry. Sad people make the best wishes." Her words struck me like a soft whisper from heaven. I smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. "You've just made my day." She grinned and ran off, her laughter echoing through the air. When the taxi started moving again, I held those daisies close to my chest. They reminded me that even strangers can see what family sometimes forgets, that we all need to be seen, even in our quietest pain. By the time we reached Willow Lane, the fog had lifted. Sunlight poured through the clouds, warm and gentle. It felt like a sign, maybe leaving wasn't an ending, but a beginning I hadn't expected. I stepped out, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, maybe this road I took alone will lead me back to love, just not the kind I left behind. Clara's house stood at the end of Willow Lane, a small white cottage wrapped in ivy and silence. When I stepped out of the taxi, she was already at the door, her hands folded, her eyes full of worry and love. "Oh, Mary," she whispered, "you finally came." Her hug was warm, the kind of warmth I had been missing for years. For a moment, the weight I'd been carrying quietly melted against her shoulder. "I didn't want to bother you," I said softly. "You could never bother me," she replied. "You're home now." Her words, "home now," they echoed in my heart like a forgotten melody. It had been so long since I'd felt that word belonged to me. Inside, everything smelled of baked bread and lavender. A small clock ticked on the wall, and a golden ray of sunlight rested on the kitchen table. Clara had prepared tea, just the way I liked it, strong, with a touch of honey. We sat quietly for a while, letting the silence fill in what years apart had left unsaid. She finally asked, "You want to tell me what happened?" I looked at my cup, watching the steam rise and fade. "There's not much to tell," I said. "Just a heart that got tired of waiting to be seen." Clara reached across the table and held my hand. "You gave too much, Mary. Sometimes love shouldn't be about endurance. It should be about peace." I nodded, tears blurring my view. Her words weren't meant to comfort, they were truth, simple and clean. That night, she showed me to a small room at the back of the house. It had lace curtains, a wooden chair, and a window that opened toward the garden. "You'll sleep here," she said. "The morning light comes straight through that window. It's the best part of the house." When she left, I sat by the window and looked out. The moonlight painted the flowers silver, and the crickets sang softly in the dark. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. The next morning, sunlight touched my face before I even opened my eyes. It felt gentle, like the world was telling me, "You're still here." I made myself a cup of tea and stepped outside into the garden. The grass was wet with dew, and a few sparrows hopped along the fence. Clara joined me a few minutes later. "You should plant something here," she said. "Something that grows fast, like marigolds." I smiled. "Maybe I will." And that morning, with my hands in the soil, I realized something. Life doesn't stop when love fades. It bends, it aches, but somehow it keeps blooming. As the days passed, I began to write in an old notebook Clara gave me. Little things, the sound of rain, the warmth of tea, the laughter of children playing outside. Small joys, stitched together like a quilt of quiet healing. Every evening, I sat by the window, the same one that welcomed sunlight in the morning, and I thought about my old home, not with anger anymore, but with peace. Because sometimes, Leaving isn't about giving up. It's about giving yourself another chance to live. It started with just a few words. The notebook was small, brown, and a little torn around the edges. Clara had placed it on my bedside table one evening. "You always had a way with words," she said. "Maybe it's time you start writing again." I smiled at her, but my heart hesitated. It had been years since I'd written anything more than a grocery list or a birthday card. But that night, after she went to bed, I opened the first page and wrote, "When you are no longer needed, you learn what love truly means." The pen trembled slightly in my hand. Yet, as the ink touched the paper, something inside me began to breathe again. Every morning, after watering the marigolds, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and write, not about pain, but about memories, small ones. The smell of my grandson's hair when I used to hold him close. The laughter in the kitchen when my son was young. The soft sound of rain on the old tin roof. Each word felt like a step, one that slowly carried me out of the darkness I had lived in for so long. Sometimes, Clara would peek in and smile. "You're glowing again," she'd say. And I would laugh softly. Maybe it's the sunlight, or maybe it's the words. One afternoon, a neighbor's daughter, Lily, came by. She was a shy little girl with curious eyes. "What are you writing?" she asked. I told her, "Just some stories about life." "Can I read them?" she said. Her question surprised me. I hesitated, but eventually, I nodded. She sat quietly, her legs swinging from the chair, reading page after page. When she finished, she looked up and whispered, "It's beautiful." It made me feel warm inside. Her simple words touched me deeper than she could ever know. For the first time, I realized maybe my story wasn't just mine. Maybe it belonged to anyone who had ever felt left behind. Days turned into weeks. Word spread around the neighborhood about the grandmother who writes stories. Children started visiting, sometimes with their mothers. They would sit on the porch while I read little parts from my notebook. One evening, a young woman said, "My mother passed away last year. When you read, it feels like she's talking to me again." Tears welled in my eyes, and I smiled through them. "Then maybe she is," I said softly. Love never really leaves. It just changes form. As time went on, my notebook grew thick, its pages filled with words of pain, hope, and quiet forgiveness. I titled it The Notebook of Quiet Hearts. Each page carried a part of me, not the woman who was rejected, but the woman who learned how to live again. Clara often teased me, "You'll be famous one day." I'd laugh and say, "I don't need to be famous, Clara, I just want my words to reach someone who needs them." And in that small sunlit room, with marigolds blooming outside my window, I finally understood that healing doesn't always come from people coming back. Sometimes, it comes from you finding yourself again. It started with just a few words. The notebook was small, brown, and a little torn around the edges. Clara had placed it on my bedside table one evening. "You always had a way with words," she said. "Maybe it's time you start writing again." I smiled at her, but my heart hesitated. It had been years since I'd written anything more than a grocery list or a birthday card. But that night, after she went to bed, I opened the first page and wrote, "When you are no longer needed, you learn what love truly means." The pen trembled slightly in my hand, yet as the ink touched the paper, something inside me began to breathe again. Every morning, after watering the marigolds, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and write, not about pain, but about memories, small ones. The smell of my grandson's hair when I used to hold him close. The laughter in the kitchen when my son was young. The soft sound of rain on the old tin roof. Each word felt like a step, one that slowly carried me out of the darkness I had lived in for so long. Sometimes, Clara would peek in and smile. "You're glowing again," she'd say. And I would laugh softly. Maybe it's the sunlight, or maybe it's the words. One afternoon, a neighbor's daughter Lily came by. She was a shy little girl with curious eyes. "What are you writing?" she asked. I told her, "Just some stories about life." "Can I read them?" she said. Her question surprised me. I hesitated, but eventually, I nodded. She sat quietly, her legs swinging from the chair, reading page after page. When she finished, she looked up and whispered, "It's beautiful." It made me feel warm inside. Her simple words touched me deeper than she could ever know. For the first time, I realized maybe my story wasn't just mine. Maybe it belonged to anyone who had ever felt left behind. Days turned into weeks. Word spread around the neighborhood about the grandmother who writes stories. Children started visiting, sometimes with their mothers. They would sit on the porch while I read little parts from my notebook. One evening, a young woman said, "My mother passed away last year. When you read, it feels like she's talking to me again." Tears welled in my eyes, and I smiled through them. "Then maybe she is," I said softly. "Love never really leaves. It just changes form." As time went on, my notebook grew thick, its pages filled with words of pain, hope, and quiet forgiveness. I titled it The Notebook of Quiet Hearts. Each page carried a part of me, not the woman who was rejected, but the woman who learned how to live again. Clara often teased me, "You'll be famous one day." I'd laugh and say, "I don't need to be famous, Clara, I just want my words to reach someone who needs them." And in that small sunlit room, with marigolds blooming outside my window, I finally understood that healing doesn't always come from people coming back. Sometimes, it comes from you finding yourself again.